Well, hello and welcome to the Introduction to Anthropology lecture. I'm Mr. G, and this is just a brief introduction into the unit on anthropology. So what anthropology is, and you may note that I'm not going to necessarily read the slideshow to you because, well, I sincerely hope you're literate and capable of reading yourself, so I'm basically going to kind of give you an overview about what it's all about and what everything is kind of discussing when we talk about the unit on anthropology. Now, anthropology itself is quite interesting in that it covers not only just humans as a species on a biological level, but it also covers our cultural engagements, and a great deal of our anthropology is in our evolution. So one of the big debates that take place in the anthropology unit is the nature and nurture. And in short, nature and nurture really comes down to, are we made by our environment, or are we made who we are because of our biology? And so this debate has raged on forever, and it comes down to basically the two, or the conclusion is just simply that both actually do play a role in who we are as a species, as who we are culturally, and so forth. If you look at physical anthropology and cultural anthropology, they have so many sub-branches to them. Yes, the overview, the overriding umbrella, I suppose you can call it, in physical anthropology is just that, all of the things that kind of go into our species on a biological level. But as you can see here, beyond just our biology, there's other species that are humanoid or human-like, and we kind of try to draw parallels between them and us, so that area is known as primatology. And then if you go into even digging, pun intended, and no pun intended, digging more deeply into our history, you'll note that a great deal of our anthropology also comes from looking back on our ancestors, what remains of societies that existed before us, what remains of societies that might have existed thousands of years prior to us. And we always try to draw conclusions from what we can dig up, literally, and try to make sense of that. On the flip side, we have cultural anthropology, and that's culture in many ways is almost, it's been described to me once, and I really do like this analogy, this metaphor, is culture is the water that a fish swims in. You're surrounded by it as a fish. You know it's there, you know it exists, but you can't quite put your finger on that one spot of the water that you are swimming in. And that's really what culture is. In many ways, culture is that. It's the water that we swim in. It is just surrounding us at all times. We're in it, we're immersed in it, we're submerged in it, we know it's there, but for some odd reason we can't quite put our finger on what culture is, or that one thing that defines culture. I'd mentioned this before. Well, you saw on the previous slide that there are subtopics, subheadings, sub-areas within cultural anthropology, or anthropology as a whole, that most people tend to be very dismissive of. Now, it's truly amazing once you start to dig into anthropology. You look at all the subfields that kind of go into it, and the more you pay attention to these subfields, the more and more you realize that there is so much more to anthropology than just simply digging up bones and saying, well, this femur or this leg bone was significantly shorter in our ancestors, therefore they were shorter than us. Well, that's great, and that is one part of it, sure. But you can't just simply narrow it down to just simply, digging up bones, or digging up fossils, or digging up old buildings and structures, or looking up at ancient temples and look at their writing. But that in and of itself is truly fascinating. If you look at the writing, for example, of previous cultures, the language of previous cultures, previous species, you really get a very, very good understanding. For those of you listening to this lecture who are, for example, fluent or speak a second language other than English, you'll truly start to understand that language does shape so much more than our culture. It also shapes the way we think, the way we view the world, our attitudes, our beliefs, and the language that we use is in many ways just that, the language. But it also does create a thought. So when someone says in English, for example, I love pizza, you don't immediately think of this person grabbing, a big pizza pie and just hugging it because, oh my God, they love that pizza so much, right? So there's a context, there's a framework, there's so much more to the phrase, I love pizza, than just simply, you like to take, long, comfortable naps with a slice of pizza in your arms. That just doesn't make sense, right? There are finer nuances to that, and that is in itself part of anthropology. Historically, I mentioned this before, we are concerned, we are, as anthropologists, we pay attention to a great many things that came before us, and we try to understand how the people before us lived, why they lived the way they lived, why they behaved the way they behaved, why they did the things that they did. And it's very easy to dismiss the past as being, well, you know, they're old and they're dead and they didn't know any better. Sure, you could do that, you could say that, but that is so superficial. That is not necessarily giving due course to these individuals, these cultures, these societies, these civilizations that existed before us by simply saying, well, they're old and dead, therefore, you know, they suck. Sure, one day, our civilization, our society, our people are going to be old and dead, and we hope that our future societies and future generations won't judge us as being, well, they were old and dead and they suck and they're terrible and they're dumb. Well, sure, you could say that. But again, that's being very dismissive of a wide breadth and width of the nuances that go into a culture, a people, a belief system, an attitude, a language, and everything. There's just so many smaller areas that we kind of overlook. So when we look at the history of anthropology, we can't just, once again, dig up that bone and say, well, I can tell you everything based on this one bone that I found. We really have to give its due respect, or the due respect, to these ancient, older, now long gone civilizations, groups, because they weren't just simply old dead bones that were buried in the soil. Other things that we look at in anthropology is not only historical societies that came before us and that are now long gone and buried in the dirt and the soil and in some cases under the water, but we look at concurrent societies, societies that live in the same time period as us right here, right now, and we look at them and we consider them as being more or perhaps less modern. And we do have civilizations and societies that exist, you know, right now in the modern day that are now living in the same way that our ancestors would have lived hundreds of years ago. And they're perfectly happy and they're perfectly comfortable and they're living their best lives. So we can even look at living history based on societies that have, you could say, not evolved. And I use that term very loosely, not evolved in the same way that we have evolved right now. They're not modernized, and therefore, you know, we can literally look at living history. And why we ask these questions is because simply this is like, was that us once upon a time? Were we the same once upon a time? This modern Western civilization that we live in right here, right now, we can look at perhaps in parts of Papua New Guinea or parts of the Pacific where people are living far less modern, we can call them more primitive lives, and we could study them as almost like a window into a living window into our past. And we do this because as anthropologists, it's all about understanding. It's not about simply just putting it out there and saying, well, we're better than them because, you know, we use guns and cannons and so forth and whatever we use, but they're still using spears and arrows and blow darts. Sure. You could use that as a frame of reference and say, yeah, we're better than them. But instead, anthropologists don't simply try to put them on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the best, 5 being the worst, but rather let's really dissect and understand why people live this way. Why haven't they chosen to evolve? Maybe they literally chose not to evolve. Maybe they're perfectly happy, content. If it works, keep doing it. Why would you change it? And so, you know, there are these points of examination that often take place by anthropologists to really truly understand other species, subspecies, you can call them, even primates. Primates you could consider to be a subspecies of humans that are very, very closely related to, genetically at least, certain primates, apes, and so forth. Can we understand them, and by understanding them, understand ourselves? So cultural anthropology, I mentioned culture before. Culture really is the water that we swim in. And we know we're surrounded by it, we're immersed in it, we live in it. But there are just so many parts of culture that kind of go more than just simply clothing and food. A lot of people just simply will default to clothing and food as being aspects of culture. That is, yes, they are aspects of, but they are not the aspects of. There are so many other areas of culture that we will often overlook, not out of choice, but in some cases not really understanding what that means. And so learning culture and learning what cultural anthropology is, at least for our unit and for our class, it makes complete sense to start to understand things like how is knowledge passed along? You know, how is knowledge passed along from our grandparents to our parents and our parents to us and us to each other? You know, that in and of itself speaks volumes. What beliefs are passed on, what attitudes, values, morals, laws, customs, you know, even religion has a part of culture, because religions themselves also have these aspects, you know, kind of buried within them. Nevertheless, it's truly amazing when you start to pay close attention to these parts of culture. You start to get a true sense of what culture is and how important and how significant it is, and the impact that it plays on people and how they live their lives. I mentioned before archaeology. You know, yes, you are digging things up, and yes, you are looking at what has gone and buried in the soil, or in some cases just above the soil. But it's more than that. It's so much more than that. It's trying to piece together a puzzle, and it truly is a puzzle. These archaeologists, you know, they give you their best guess based on the puzzle pieces that they unearth, that they discover, and try to put together a puzzle without, and if you've ever put together a puzzle, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's like putting together a puzzle without the box and having pieces and not the full number of pieces. Let's say there's 100 pieces, let's say you only have 50 of them. And so you're putting together this picture without the actual picture to refer to on the cover of the box. And now you've got half of the pieces, and you're putting these pieces together, and you're basically trying to make sense of what the puzzle picture is based on the pieces that you have and the pieces that are missing. And sometimes, you know, we'll find extra pieces and put them into our puzzle, and eventually we start to make more and more sense of it. And archaeology is just that archaeological discovery on anthropological level, at least, is very much like trying to piece together a puzzle with not a lot of pictures and images to work from. Applied anthropology is very interesting in the sense that you're basically trying to put together patterns, and it really is patterns. So we've studied this civilization, this culture over here, and we found aspects of a different civilization culture over here, for example, and just pretend that I'm holding my hands up in two different spots. And then we find a third one. And so now you're triangulating. You're basically taking what you know from 1, 2, and 3 cultures, and you're trying to find the similarities, the differences. Do we have so many similarities across all 3 of them that we can now start to say, well, now we're starting to make sense of this as being, you know, a commonality. Or there are very unique, interesting aspects. Why? Why are they unique over here, but not over here? You know, and so you really try to you make sense of it. And that's the beauty of not just simply digging things up, but then what are you going to do with the evidence? I personally think linguistics is absolutely fascinating. Linguistics is truly the study of language. And when someone says a word, it's fascinating because the word is literally just a sound that comes out of one's mouth, which then creates an image in the mind of the person listening to that word. So if I say the word stop, well, somebody might just think of a stop sign. But then somebody might also think of like somebody just stop, like freeze, don't do anything else. And so then you say to yourself, so the word stop could conjure 2 different images in someone's mind by just simply saying stop. Or the word love, as I mentioned to you before, I love pizza, right? And I could say, well, I love my mom. Well, okay, so I love pizza and I love my mom. Do I love my mom the same way I love pizza? Like I don't, every time I see pizza, you run up and give it a big hug and kiss, say, I love you, right? That's weird. Or maybe it's not. Maybe you love pizza so much that maybe your mom feels like she's second best to your pizza because pizza gets all your love and affection. You know, on Valentine's Day, did you send a pizza Or maybe did you send a Valentine's Day card to a piece of pizza saying, I love you, I can't live without you? You know, this is so bizarre. And linguistics kind of dissects these concepts and these ideas based on the language we speak. And it's truly amazing because English is not the language. There are so many other languages, and so many other languages have subtleties and nuances. And to say love in different languages is in and of itself quite unique. Someone once said to me that the Inuit have so many different words for snow. Well, we have one word for snow, but to them, well, snow is important. Why? Well, because, well, they're surrounded by it. And in some cases, they live in it, say 9 months out of the year, for example, just drawing a magic number out of the sky. Well, you would think then that this language for snow would have different meanings because, well, snow is important. Snow for people, for example, who live in Arizona probably wouldn't consider snow to be, you know, anything more than just this thing that happens every so often, if at all. In Canada, for example, well, we get snow. Oh, we do get snow. And parts of Canada get different kinds of snow. And does that mean then that we have different words for the snow? Absolutely, right? There's slushy snow, there's powder. You know, like if you're a skier, you understand snow, or a snowboarder, you understand snow and the meaning behind the word snow. And yes, it snowed today, but it's not the right kind of snow, for example. And that in and of itself is beautiful because, not snow, but understanding the word and understanding the way the word has evolved and how it changes and how language is being used. Socioculture, okay, so really truly fascinating. We will study sociology later on in this course. But one thing you have to truly understand is that though, you know, anthropology, psychology, and sociology are 3 separate units in this course, they are not separate. They are in fact quite well connected because they don't necessarily just kind of independently exist without the other. So what ends up happening is that you'll have anthropology and aspects of anthropology that mesh with parts of psychology, and parts of anthropology and psychology that mesh with parts of sociology. And they have so many interconnections that you can't just simply say one is independent and never exists without the others. But they all, at some point, and you'll see in this course, all kind of connect to each other in some fashion, whether it be large or small. And the beautiful thing about sociocultural anthropology is that it covers these aspects of sociology and to a degree psychology and anthropology, and they all kind of come together in ways that you really can't find the distinction or the difference between one and or the other. So you have to be very, very mindful of this kind of stuff and pay close attention to it. Physical anthropology I covered quite a bit previously, you know, and I'll kind of touch on it very briefly right now because I know this lecture is starting to get long, and in some ways it can be quite tedious. Nevertheless, truly amazing. You know, when you look at this image here, and if you can kind of see my mouse, the arrow kind of pointing to this image of evolution. For the longest time, this was the evolutionary image. Like it always went from like monkey to human, and you know, this guy's carrying a spear, right? So what? How has that been evolution? This is so oversimplified. And if you refer to this as being your one and only kind of study of evolution, I would argue that perhaps you haven't paid close enough attention to us as a species. Why? Well, this is very oversimplified. This takes so many things out of the equation that it dismisses so much that it basically says that we went from monkey to man in about 5 steps, or 3 steps if you want to count the ones in between only. So we went from here to here in 3 steps. And you're like, well, that took place of thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, and blah, 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 this, that, and the other. Sure. I would argue, if you've ever seen the movie The Croods, that is a much more accurate description of anthropology or our physical evolution than this image here. Why? That's a great question. I'm glad I asked myself that. Here's the reason. You take all these factors that go into evolution, and when you study evolution on a scientific level at least, you realize that a lot goes into it. Environment, absolutely. Food, well, that's part of the environment, absolutely. Climate, that's part of the environment, absolutely. Other individuals, whoa, that also goes into it. So if this image was comprehensive, in other words, if this was the be-all and end-all image of our evolution, then how did we get from here to here in 3 easy steps? And how come the monkeys that still exist today are still monkeys and they're not human, if that was the case? Well, there's so much more that goes into it. There really has to be. There has to be. Charles Darwin famously was the one who kind of came up with this concept of evolution and this notion of survival of the fittest. And that in and of itself, that language, survival of the fittest, makes people think that, or at least conjures in the minds of some, the concept that they're better. Well, sometimes evolution isn't for the better. Sometimes you actually evolve for the worse. Or in some cases, the part of evolution that selected, or is selected to keep that species alive is just simply luck. Or it's simply they're in the right place at the right time. Or they did not die because they weren't attacked by predators, because they were lucky enough to have evolved in a way that the predators didn't quite see them. In short, what I'm trying to tell you is that studying evolution is very, very vast, and it's very intricate, and it takes so much more than just simply, well, they're stronger, bigger, faster, they have better spears, better arrows, better guns, better this, better that. Sure, that could have been an aspect, but if you consider things like, for example, I will use a concept of a moth that's been used in previous times. During the Industrial Revolution, there was a great deal of smog in the atmosphere. Now, moths themselves were white, like as in pale. And the pale moths, became or stayed pale, and they were able to hide on trees because they would stay on white barked trees, like birch trees, for example. And so they wouldn't be spotted by the birds that would eat them because they were camouflaged, because they were white and the same kind of color. They had evolved to be the same color as the birch trees where they would hide. They would just sit on the tree and not move, and the birds wouldn't see them, so they would survive. They would breed. They would make more pale moths. Now, the Industrial Revolution comes around in the 1800s, and there's a lot of smog in the atmosphere. Well, smog tends to stick on things. And so when smog sticks on things, it starts to make the birch white trees start to go more brown, gray, not as white and pale as they would normally be in nature without any kind of external influence. So now the pale moth that sits on the birch tree, which used to be pale, but now it's kind of gray and kind of looking like it's got ash on it or charcoal on it, now suddenly that moth stands out like nobody's business. And the bird is like, well, you normally hide out there and I couldn't see you, but now that the trees changed colors and you're the same color, guess what? Num, num, num. So these moths get eaten by birds. Well, they don't breed, they don't make more baby moths of the same color. But you have moths that had different colors. And these moths that are different colors tend to match the new color of the tree. Well, guess what? The birds don't see them anymore. They're still sitting on the same tree, but they blend with the tree background to the point where now the bird can't see them. Well, guess which moths are going to breed and make more baby moths of the same color? The colored moths that are colored the same color as the tree that they sit on now. And so, yes, the ones that were the whiter moths, so to speak, we'll call them the pale moths, that are sitting on the more pale tree bark are camouflaged, but then the tree bark changes, well, that camouflage is no longer a thing. And the birds are like, perfect, that's a pretty delicious moth right there. And the ones that were kind of like a little less pale and tend to blend with their environment better tend to survive simply because the environment changes, the moth changes. And that's just one very, very isolated example. If you know anything about the Galapagos Islands where Charles Darwin went, he studied birds and different species on these islands. Islands are great ecosystems because they're enclosed. In many cases, what's on the island stays on the island kind of thing. And what's amazing is what Darwin discovered is that even the same bird species on an island, which are the same bird, more or less, on different sides of the island actually have different traits to them because different sides of the island have different climates, different areas, different regions, different bugs to eat, different flowers, and so forth and so forth. And so each of those birds and those families of birds, so to speak, had to evolve. Even though they're the exact same species of bird, they're unique offshoots of that same species simply because they had to be able to adapt to their environment. And that adaptation could have been just simply because they had to change the way they ate, or just simply to avoid predators, or it's just simply because of whatever it was, the climate was different, so they had to be able to build different kinds of nests. But the long and the short of it is just simply this, is that what we're understanding now more and more about physical anthropology is that sometimes evolution can take place within a generation. Sometimes all of the factors that go into evolution kind of play into how the species evolves and changes and transforms. And so when we study human evolution, and we do study human evolution, when we look at that, we start to understand more and more that a great deal of evolution is, yes, adaptation, but it's also having the luck of the environment around you, having the ability to transform yourself, if needs be, to adapt to your new situation. And ultimately, a lack of adaptation will usually mean that in some way, shape, or form, that part of the species will eventually die off and not breed and not create more of that same species. Because that's really how it goes. The evolution is just simply the perpetuation of the species. I mentioned this before. Our biology is a key part, and what goes into our biology is environmental, but it's also social, so that's that nature versus nurture. The environment would be the nurture part. Nature is who you are genetically, and though we like to think that we are genetically one way or another, we're really truly as a species starting to understand what genetics mean. Only in the last 20 years have we and our scientists made sense of our genes and being able to map out the human genome. I mentioned this before, primates. Studying primates kind of helps us understand a little bit of ourselves, assuming that we have evolved from primates. And it would make the most sense to look at the ones that are genetically close to us. From what I recall, I think our closest primate cousin, and don't quote me on this, but it's like 97% genetically identical to us. So there's 3% difference between us and them. And then that begs the question, if we all evolved from apes, then how come there's still apes around? That's a great question. I mentioned this before. I talked about forensic anthropology, and even the modern take on forensics is that, we don't have to go back tens of thousands or hundreds of years to, identify what's gone on in our species and our evolutionary past. Even to this day, people are anthropologists and forensic anthropologists, I guess you could say, even on crime scenes, for example, try to piece together a crime scene that could have happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago, last week, based on the evidence that they find. They now have to piece together the story. And that's really what it is. It's piecing together the story. Anyway, that's the end of it. I'm not going to dig too deeply into this, but I do hope that you got a good sense of how significant anthropology is and how big of a role it plays in our study of the human species. I hope that makes sense to you. If you have any questions, feel free to send them my way.